Right, so this video is going to be about antinatalism. It's a subject that I feel overlaps heavily with things like inceldom, male loneliness, and MGTOW, and modernity. I was inspired to make this video because I begun to notice, curiously, that I was getting a lot of videos by self-proclaimed antinatalists in my YouTube recommended videos feed. And initially I was quite closed off to the idea, but the more the antinatalist video channels I came across, the more I heard them speak. I'd be lying if I said there weren't parts of what they had said and underlying tenets of their philosophy that didn't somehow resonate with me. Now, I wouldn't call myself a full-blown scholar of antinatalism. I haven't read, I haven't really read the big holy book or what the actual main proponents of them have written down, but the essential key arguments for antinatalism is that life is inherently suffering, it's inherently bad, it's basically a zero-sum game where for you to live, other creatures, other sentient beings who would otherwise occupy the space that you occupy must necessarily die or lose out on resources. And life is inherently unequal and quite meaningless. I think it correlates heavily with atheism and nihilism, which really I ought to make a video on both of those too. Now, there's one antinatalist in particular whose videos I came across, I stumbled on by accident. His name was, well, originally he had a channel called The Realist Rant Man, but then he lost his channel and now he has a new one called The Real Mr. Antinatalist. Now, out of respect for the guy's privacy, he's in his early 20s. I mean, I know he has a channel and his real name has been used, but out of respect for the guy, I'm going to abstain from using his real name. Based on how he describes his life, the reason why he's an antinatalist, at first glance, at a prima facie glance, you might think, why would anybody want to be an antinatalist? That the idea that you shouldn't have children because it's inherently immoral and that having children is wrong, why would anyone believe in something so counterintuitive and so unnatural? Well, when I came across this guy's channel and I heard how he lucidly and at a leisurely and casual pace explained what his life was like, he comes from a broken home. Basically, his mum and dad, I think they're separated or they might be divorced. I'm not sure exactly, but they don't live together. So he hasn't grown up with the privilege of living in a close-knit family together. Now, obviously, that is not good. The fact that more and more people are being born into broken homes and families that aren't living together, the fact that it's more popular now is never going to convince me or anyone for that matter that that's the normal state of things. He is quite open and self-conscious about the fact that he has Asperger's and some form of ADHD, and I think he says he has OCD as well. I don't want to be Dr. Phil here, but there are little tells in the way he talks and the way he presents himself that show he is, in some respects, and I mean this, I don't mean this with any kind of judgment whatsoever. He does come off as mildly handicapped. He does things that may be perceived as gauche or kind of clumsy, and I don't mean any disrespect to the guy, because he's very, like I said earlier, he's a genuine guy with genuine feelings. He's a real person with real feelings, and I respect that. I have a deep sense of warmth and humility before people who are unapologetically and unabashedly honest about who they are, how they see the world, how they act when they're not trying to put on an act and act as though they're a different person. I don't mean any kind of judgment towards the guy. And it makes perfect sense from his perspective why he feels that having children is wrong, because in terms of genetics and in terms of social upbringing, the guy was dealt a shitty hand. I still watch his videos even now, actually. I find his monologues to be, well, on the one hand, they're quite interesting, they're quite illuminating. I mean, the guy's quite younger than me, but it's always refreshing to hear what other people have to say on life. I think a lot of his day-to-day musings are more or less what a lot of people secretly feel deep down, but are too self-conscious to admit openly. Or a lot of people fear that there might be some sort of social repercussion for admitting publicly private thoughts that, for the sake of keeping up appearances, ought to remain quiet. And it makes perfect sense. Now, and I wouldn't, honestly, part of me wants to tell people like him, Mr. Antinatalism, that you shouldn't give up on life. You should just keep on trying, and you should try to be positive. But that's not really what I want to do, because first of all, it would be completely disingenuous for me to give advice like that to somebody who believes life is inherently meaningless. For me to give advice like that, I would need to unironically believe that life was not meaningless. And I don't have such a conviction. Not right now, in any case. So I would not just need to lie to him, but I need to lie to myself too. And I don't have the stomach to do that. I would want to say to him also, don't be too hard on yourself, because nobody on this planet is ever perfect. And no matter how unattractive you might appear, no matter how socially inadequate you might seem, no matter how miserable you are, there's always some poor bastard on this shithole planet who's worse than you are. And goodness, those people ought to get a YouTube channel of their own. I'm being half serious here, but anyway, one might think, if you're watching this video, based on how I described the guy in his anti-natalism channel, you might be compelled to ask, what are my personal thoughts on anti-natalism? Am I an anti-natalism? Do I think anti-natalism is a sound philosophy? Is it something that I would recommend? If I were the God Emperor of Britain or the world, what sort of policies would I instigate? That would I try and enforce an anti-natalist kind of regime? Well, not exactly. So I'm going to tell you what my thoughts are. So obviously my life circumstances are a bit different to that guy, Mr. Antinatalism. And this is important to note because there's one YouTube channel who's very popular. His name's Rudyard Lynch. His YouTube channel name is What If Altist. And he said something that really got me thinking, that really got the gears in my head turning. Every single belief or ideology is a form of rationalization. That is to say, your beliefs about humanity and about how the world works and how people should behave are to a very great extent influenced by your internal psychology and how you perceive the world and how you are as a person. And thus, ipso facto, it makes sense to infer from this that people are attracted to philosophies like antinatalism for very particular reasons. And as I've said with Mr. Antinatalist, again, it sounds cruel. I really don't want to come off as heartless when I say this, but, well, the guy is pretty candid about the fact that he's sort of average looking. I don't want to call people ugly because I don't want to look like a massive prick. But I mean, I would call him average looking at best. Like he's I suppose there are things he might be able to do that might make him look better, but honestly, some people are just born with really with amazing facial features. Some people they have this smooth, clear skin. Some people have huge muscles. Some people just have a winning mentality where they're always positive. They see the world in a constructive and logical manner that helps them to succeed and thrive. You know, as people, we are all bound by forces that we can neither comprehend nor reason with. There's this ongoing debate as to nature or nurture, which one is the biggest influencer, and I'm more inclined to say the former. I think a large part of human behavior is down to genetics. In a sense, I would call myself a genetic predeterminist. Then there is the matter of how you are socialized, how you're brought up into the world, but as a person, you have control over neither of those things. And this idea of free will. So free will, the idea that you are ultimately responsible for your actions, well, I would agree only from a legal standpoint that we need to hold people responsible for actions so that we can judge them and accordingly, and so that we can live in a fair society. But fundamentally, deep down, I don't think anybody's responsible for their actions. I don't even think anybody's responsible for their thoughts, their interests, their hobbies, their dislikes. I think it's all an illusion. And people such as Mr. Antinatalist, well, he's a person who, I think he views it more or less the same kind of way that I do. That free will is a myth. That this life we inhabit is some kind of bizarre simulation where we think we're in the cockpit of a plane, but in reality, we're not the pilot. We're just a passenger on a plane that's basically on autopilot. It's a bit of a long-winded metaphor, not the exact one that he used, but you kind of see where I'm going with this. So anyway, as I was saying, all philosophy is based on some form of rationalization of one's own internal psyche, of how one perceives the world. And the people who gravitate towards philosophies like antinatalism are usually those who, well, from an objective standpoint, they have every reason to consider life utterly hopeless. And people who are, quite rightly, resentful to the fact that they were born into a world that seems largely indifferent to their inner thoughts, their inner problems, in which they live a mediocre or shitty existence, where society tricks them into believing that they're responsible for things that they have no fundamental control over, where they are inculcated with desires and aspirations which in reality they have no possible means, no hope at all of achieving. And we are socialized to feel guilty. I think even in a biological sense, we're made to feel guilty when we don't get what we want out of life. It's a form of torture. If anybody's heard of the ancient Greek myth of there was in ancient Greece, in ancient Greek religion, the bottom circle of hell was a place called Tartarus. And there was one individual who was sentenced for all eternity to be tortured there by the name of Tantalus. And this guy, Tantalus, he committed such an horrific crime. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his eternity living in a place where there was water at his feet, but if he stooped down to drink it, it would shrink away from him. And then there was fruit that was positioned above him, but if he tried reaching for it, the fruit would disappear. And incidentally, this is where where the word tantalizing comes from. The reason why I brought this up is because life is kind of like this. There are these things that we are made to want. Like, we all want to be with big, beautiful women. We all want to have lots of children. We all want houses. But for all practical and realistic purposes, how many men are in a position where they can get those things? There's a growing awareness that lots of people are frustrated and angry because we're made to feel like we have a fighting chance in a game that is totally rigged against us. And there's many different ways one can react or respond when one comes to terms with the utter futility and hopelessness that is existing in a world where the odds are stacked against us. And this is not a universal experience, mind. There are some people who they just got it all. They've got wealth, they got good looks, they've got social connections. They don't really seem to be wanting for much because life is kind of like that. Some people are just born lucky, but many people are not born lucky. And a philosophy like antinatalism is one such way in which one may react. After steadily over the years coming to terms with the fact that life is inherently unfair, it's a bizarre kind of illusion, a simulation where we exist in this sort of game where we're made to want things that we cannot possibly achieve any means of acquiring. And people might call antinatalism an unnatural philosophy, but I guess it's true. But I would say it's a uniquely human philosophy. Humans are probably the only creatures in the universe who could intellectually come to terms with the hopelessness and futility of being. Historically, we all know that on some level, life is not fair, and in fact, it never was and never has been. Like, if you go back in history, we have twice as many female ancestors as we do male ancestors. What this means is that there's an untold number of young men who died celibate, who never got to spread their seed. Because the history of human evolution has always been a race to the top among the highest quality men with the most beautiful women. And women have always been competing and vying to outdo each other to secure for themselves the highest quality mate. But nobody seems to care about how many men have died in the process, and how many men have died hopelessly in obscurity, in poverty, in hopelessness. We would, in a metaphorical sense, as people, we are all walking on the bones, on the ground dust of the bones and decayed corpses of billions, probably hundreds of billions of poor saps who never made it. If you ever watch BBC Top of the Pops, or if you ever watch TV features about up-and-coming new musicians, I guarantee this: for every 5 or 6 successful rock bands or new up-and-coming singers who get signed and becomes famous, there's got to be like 5 or 6,000, probably not even that, 50 or 60,000 potential wannabe bands or singers who don't make it. But nobody ever hears about them. None of us do. There's no interest, there's no appetite to know about the failed journeys of people who wanted to make it big but never did. We have this skewed appetite. We have this bias that skews towards hearing of people who, in a very real sense, aren't really representative of humanity as a whole. Because we live in a world where we only want success. We only tolerate success. We look up to people who have succeeded, and we're not really interested to hear from the other 80 or 90%. I'm kind of pulling imaginary numbers here out of thin air, but you understand how the game is played. Nobody cares a fig for all those other people. And if one finds oneself in a position where one is confronted with this inconvenient reality that the nature of the world is that we're not equal, we never have been equal, and we never will be, this idea that fairness and equality is in fact very much, it's a purely human invention just to keep society functional, to stop us all from slashing each other's throats and going to war with each other. Is it any wonder that there are some people who are not only checking out of the gene pool, but who see it as morally virtuous to do so? Like, if you were born in a set of circumstances like he was, and there's plenty of others, by the way. I'm less familiar with other people's circumstances, but I do believe that people who are antinatalists do fit within specific sort of archetypes. Like, there are things that you know to look out for. I won't elaborate. Could one not predict that you would eventually necessarily become an antinatalist? And let's reverse our reverse way of thinking. If Mr. Antinatalism was born in totally different circumstances, where he'd ended up being 6 feet tall, having blonde hair and blue eyes, he looked basically exactly like those models on Abercrombie and Fitch, and he grew up in a rich house where his parents, not only were they both together, but they one of them had a job as a lawyer where he made 6-figure sums each year or something like that, and he had women just queuing to get his autograph and to get a dose of his, hop on his pogo stick, as it were. Of course he wouldn't be an antinatalist. He'd probably be the opposite. He'd be a pro-natalist. He'd be sowing his wild oats all over the world. And this is how this all relates back to what I was saying earlier about Rudyard Lynch and his idea that all philosophy is a form of rationalization based on one's own lived experience. However, obviously, as I've said earlier, my personal circumstances are different to Mr. Antinatalist. And while there are tenets of antinatalist philosophy which do kind of resonate with me, I would stop short of calling myself an antinatalist. I say this because, well, I think there are certain ingredients, there are certain things that one must necessarily have if one is to live a happy and fulfilling life. A good example is growing up in a 2-parent household where there is structure and order. I mean, my dad isn't around in my life anymore, but he was there for my formative years. I grew up and we were poor, but for the most part, money, there's a kind of tenuous link between money and happiness and life fulfillment, but I'd say up until quite recently, we had enough to sort of get by and enjoy the little things. But the reason why I don't call myself an antinatalist is because I would describe myself as what I call, I don't know if this is an actual term that exists, but I think it should need to be invented. I describe myself as a conditional antinatalist. And what this means is there are certain conditions that must be fulfilled if one is to propagate one's species. And if those conditions, for whatever reason, are not met, if you don't tick all those boxes, then yes, it is just and it is fitting that you should not only die, but you should not pollute humanity and the world with your subpar, mediocre existence. Because the fates or the gods, call it what you will, have all decreed that you were not meant to succeed. And if you weren't meant to succeed, how is it fair that you would expect your child to succeed? What chance could they possibly have if you yourself couldn't do it? So those are my thoughts, honestly. In fact, I would even go one step further and say I'm not really an anti-natalist in the universal sense. I believe there's definitely some people who should not breed. In fact, I even think that some people should be sterilized so that they should not be allowed to breed. I believe that if there are certain signs that one can pick up in unborn children, they should be terminated. The reason I feel strongly about this is because it's based on my lived experience. There are things in my life that I lack due to forces that are beyond my control. And I think it's unfair to subject future potential children who will eventually be adults in a world that expects a fair bit from everyone to play a game in which the odds are stacked even more heavily against them than they are for somebody like me. Now, I am, for the most part, I would call myself quite functional. However, I will probably make a future video in which I talk about why I'm deeply unhappy and why I suspect I may or may not have Asperger's or some form of autism, how it's led me to the conclusions about life that I hold now, and why parts of anti-natalism do resonate with me. But as such, while I have a measure of respect for anti-natalists in the sense that they're just people, they're just speaking their truth because they are real people with real feelings. They're calling it how they see it, but their experience is not the universal experience. Not everyone sees the world they do, and I think they're acutely aware of that. And while part of me does sympathize, I would not call myself, at least not at this stage, I do not consider myself to be a dyed-in-the-wool anti-natalist. I'm not going to grab a pair of, garden clippers and cut my balls off so as to stop myself from having kids, because I'm really on the fence so far on the matter as to whether it would be right for me to father children into the world. And the way I see it is, it would depend on whether certain conditions were able to be met. So let's talk about in a theoretical future where I land that perfect job. I become a qualified truck driver, or I end up raking in lots of big bucks after finishing my course as a surveyor and raking in lots of money, and I somehow managed to pull this amazing, beautiful woman who's also loyal and kind and caring, and who gels with me and my personality, and things start to get better. Well, then obviously my outlook on life would change a lot, and it would be right for me to have children. And I would teach all those children all the lessons, all the basic truths about life that I never learned in my formative years, so as to make sure that they don't end up like me. But if by the age of 40 that still hasn't happened, I'm still working a shitty job, earning peanuts. I don't know if it's still with my courier company, or if I've left or if I'm unemployed, then it is just as well. It is fitting that I should die alone, and I should not advance my genetic interests, because it would be immoral on an individual level for my children to exist with the same kind of neuroses and neurodevelopmental challenges that I had, And it would be wrong on a societal level, because I'd be subjecting a future generation of people to deal with a person who I can only describe as, in some way, genetically defective. Anyway, those are my thoughts on antinatalism. I might flesh this out and make more videos in the future, but for now, I think those are my thoughts. I'll see you guys later when I've got another idea for a video. Till then.